As many of you know, I like a good tower defense game, and recently I was sent a key for a new one being developed by the same people who brought you the classic Element TD series. Though this leans much more heavily into the sci-fi space with rogue AI, cutting-edge technology, and rampaging robots. And what Axon TD lacks in creativity with its name, it more than makes up for in actual gameplay, since while it introduces a new way to maze with the ability to actually construct the very platforms enemies walk on, it still maintains many of the clean functions and mechanically diverse towers you expect from a properly designed tower defense game. And unlike a lot of recent competitors in this space, it also includes a decent variety of play modes, even if a few of them are still in development as of the release into early access. Now, diving into those, we actually have 4 proper modes, and of course, tutorial. Quick Play provides you the ability to jump into a single map, ranked by difficulty, and play a standalone challenge for either personal glory or even to compete on the game's leaderboards. The campaign, outside of being essentially a more advanced tutorial, also provides you with the story about who you are and why you're fighting hordes of rampaging robots. And while they only have the first 2 chapters done as of the entry into early access, the cutscenes are solid enough, and the story, while a bit stilted, is better than what you're going to get in most tower defense games, and has a campy sci-fi charm to it. Now, survival is for those folks looking to really push their luck and skill to the limit, since it is a longer and more randomized experience than quick play, as you fight wave after wave of enemies slowly gathering upgrades and perks to see just how far you can get. Again, for personal challenges, or if you're really into these types of games, competing for yet another leaderboard. Survival is also a bit unique compared to the other modes, since it also includes a few roguelite aspects, both in-game and in between the games. The between games is just unlocking currency for perks that allows you to make the survival challenge easier, though they do come at the cost of score, so to get the highest place on the leaderboard, you will need to do it without any of these on. You also get to choose the starting loadout of 2 towers and 2 abilities between the runs, since most of the towers, upgrades, and perks you get will be found during the run as you choose your upgrades between waves. Usually it's pairing a tower, an upgrade, or a perk with 1 or 2 of the game's resources. The other roguelite aspect that is in the actual tower defense part of survival are the expansion pieces. Not so much that they show up every few waves, but rather that they provide a randomly shaped addition to the map for you to expand your maze into, and where you place them will give you specific bonuses, which are really handy. And the last of the play modes is the co-op mode, which I can't really try yet, but I wager it works like co-op in most other tower defense games, but since this is a pre-release press key, needless to say there hasn't been much opportunity for me to test it outside of this just basic little introduction to it, so we'll have to wait for the proper release to give it an actual serious spin. Now, all of these modes play by mostly the same rules. You create mazes using the towers, you can place traps and mines on the actual walking path, and you can use whatever unlocks you have access to do the best you can against the various enemies, of which there are a decent amount, some good and some slightly frustrating. While most enemies will eventually have armor and shields that you need to overwhelm, you can usually pick your towers to bypass them, or if you're good at mazing, you can sometimes even just slow enemies down enough that your normal damage weapons will punch through these protections. Most of the spawning enemies are also fairly manageable, with troop carriers just spawning a small squishy group of swarm enemies that most area of effect towers can handle, and some alternate spawners that can launch super fast rockets, just rocket-looking enemies, can be a bit tougher if they pop near the end of the path, but they're still handleable. The ones that can get a bit more irritating are the healing enemies and the flying enemies. The healing enemies do an area of effect heal to all the enemy accents when they die, especially if you're set up to do a lot of splash damage rather than the direct damage. They can get real annoying, since it will counteract your advantage here. While the flying enemies have weird rules about where they can and can't go, and generally just make all of your mazing pretty much useless, so on maps with them you need to pack decent firepower into that core path to the end, especially near the end of the path, since while they are slow, they don't have to worry about going 20 miles to get to their goal, and will bypass a lot of your towers off on the branches you take. The fun thing is there's also bosses to worry about as well, though I actually kind of like their mechanic. Basically, bosses move through the level like normal, but will pause when all the other units from their wave have died. That means you will be spreading them out over several waves, and you can actually do some fun mazing tricks, trapping, etc. with them that you can't do as easily with normal enemies, which makes them kind of fun to experiment with, even though a solid maze will generally be better. Now that leaves the towers and the abilities. The abilities are fairly basic. You can spend your energy resource to cause different effects to your towers, ranging from boosting their range or attack speed to having them send out a high damage shockwave to hit enemies nearby. I'm not sure if it's intentional, but it does seem you can only use this once per tower per wave though. So use them wisely if you do, and since energy, like most of your resources, is fairly limited, it is definitely a tough decision as to whether you want to use these abilities unless necessary to avoid death. This is because the energy used on these abilities is also used for your towers, namely to choose their upgrade path, since each tower, trap, and mine has 3 paths that can be taken down in terms of upgrades, and all of these paths cost varying amounts of energy to do. Now, some of these are just damage boosts, but most of them are function augmenters for the already fairly well-balanced and interesting tower types, and some of the upgrades may be the key to dealing with more advanced enemies. This is especially true since you can only hold so many buildable objects on your bar, so generally you're going to be having towers and traps pulling double duties on one function or another, whether that's modifying it to bypass shields or armor, or giving a tower the ability to EMP away enemy abilities temporarily. Sure, there's buildings that do these things natively, but sometimes you might not have room to include them all and still have the cost, damage, and mazing potential you want. This limited pool of tools actually helps the game remain more interesting for me, since every run is a new puzzle, and it's not just lining up all the right towers in the right order, but rather finding the right screwdriver to use as a hammer, since there wasn't room for the hammer in the small toolbox you were able to bring. And also keeps you from bringing every support building or trap known, since you do still need some firepower in there. This smart use of limited tools is especially important on randomized maps like Survival, since you sometimes will be set up for short range and end up getting a map with a ton of holes in it, so you need to adapt to firing over those holes to keep the damage rolling, and the upgrade choices can really help with this. Now, as far as the actual interface and playability, it's solid, and you can tell the tower defense pedigree is at work here. It's intuitive, and the sound and visual design are very clear and clean to keep it enjoyable, while still keeping a solid and cohesive aesthetic. I think the only thing I might nitpick is that you cannot set the waves to automatically go at max speed, but instead you have to click twice on the launch wave button or press the hotkey to get going each and every wave. But that's the nitpicking that should tell you something. There's also one other kind of interesting feature in Axon TD that you don't usually see in other tower defense games, even ones with similar leaderboards. And that is how it actually has a replay system. So if you wanted to go see how the top ranked player got their score in Survival, you can go do that. And I oddly enough think that's a really cool thing, since it not only sort of helps keep people a little more honest, I mean there'll still be cheaters, but it can serve as a really good tool for learning higher level play in the game. Now, is this a game I'm going to sink 10,000 hours into? Probably not, but it is an excellent game for scratching that tower defense itch, even with it only being early access. Now, if you'd like to check out another interesting tower defense in the works, click on the video on screen now, and if you want to see these videos ad-free, hit up the Patreon link down below.